which is translated, and he lived. This is the last portion of the Torah in the book of Genesis, and so I'm going to go ahead, since this is Friday night, and you normally don't read from the scroll Friday night, but since you won't be here tomorrow, I'm going to go ahead and give you the Hazek B'nei Shazik, which means to be strong, and being strengthened from fulfilling the book of the Lord. And our parashah comes from Genesis 47, verse 28 to Genesis 50, verse 26. Our Haftarah portion this week is from 1 Kings, chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And our Chadasha portion is taken out of the book of 1 Peter 1, 1 through 9. First, I'd like to tell you a little kosher joke I found. Well, Rabbi Ezra and his wife and their children were really curious as to why Gentiles were so fond of eating pork. And so they decided to try some. But there was nowhere in town so that they could go and not be seen. And so one weekend, the rabbi and his family traveled over 200 miles to a distant town and went into a restaurant and ordered roast pork. And while they were waiting to be served, a member of Rabbi Ezra's synagogue walks in. He sees the rabbi and his family, and the member asks if he could join them for dinner. And the rabbi has no choice but to agree. And a while later, the waiter returns for the rabbi's meal. He takes the cover off the large platter, and there is a whole roast pig with an apple in its mouth. And the synagogue member is more than a little shocked. "What a fancy place!" exclaims the rabbi quickly. "Just look how they serve the apple I ordered." Good shot. He's a quick rabbi too. Well, you know, this is like I said earlier, this is the last portion in the book of Genesis before we begin the book of Shemot or Exodus. And even though it begins with the numbering of Jacob's years and that he passes and dies, and then again it also contains in it where Joseph dies while still in Egypt, this parashah is rightly named "And He Lived," VaYechi, because it is about life. It's about not only physical life, but the spiritual life. It's about the struggle of life in which we as believers must endure in order to be the ever-present witness to whom our God is and His Messiah Yeshua. Believers' lives, more than anything else, are what testify to the mercy and the grace that is our Lord. And this is evident by the way the parashah opens up with the acknowledgement of Jacob's impending death. This type of introduction is very similar to a parashah earlier in the year of Sarah, which also begins with the death of Sarah, but in reality it focuses on the continuity of the people of God through the finding of a wife for Isaac by Eliezer, of the finding of Rebekah. This parashah is unique in that it does not, like other parashahs, begin with a purpose break in the Torah to be found, but it is in the middle of a line of Torah. And the portion opens by revealing the number of years that Jacob lived after going down to Egypt to escape the famine and be reconciled with Joseph, his dearly beloved son, in whom he had thought dead. Now Jacob lived 17 years in Egypt with Joseph and all of his sons before he dies. But this is not the end of the story. For Israel must enter into that crucible of testing that will make it the nation that will bear God's presence before the world. Why? Because Israel is not just a people, but they are the reality of the fulfilled existence of humanity being reconciled back to God. We always think of Israel or the Jewish people as just a set-apart people, but it's more than that. They are the testimony to God's willingness to reconcile Himself to man. It is the living witness of salvation in and of itself, even though in not a perfect form. It is the submission of and salvation from our sinful lives into obedience and redemption that our souls lacked, and being brought back into right relationship with the Lord that Israel testifies to. When we study the lives of Jacob and Joseph and his brothers, we see that this principle is what is exhibited throughout the parashah. Joseph, of course, as we remember, He was rejected by his brothers, sold into slavery, but because of God's purpose plan for his life and Joseph's obedient faith to God, God brought victory that ultimately led to his holding the second greatest position of power in the known world of the time, that gave him the ability to save the Jewish people from annihilation of starvation. Jacob as well overcomes the obstacles of his life through the constant faith in God and his promises. We see this as we went through the book of Genesis. Jacob leaves his home because of the way he has gotten the birthright from Esau. And along the way, he faces Laban. He faces challenges with Laban and his daughters. And then on his way back home, he faces challenges with reconciling to his brother Esau. His whole life was full of trials and challenges. And just as Joseph's life was full of these trials and struggles, Joseph understood them to be what will exemplify who God is. We find this in Genesis 50, verses 19 through 20. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Don't be afraid, for am I in the place of God? Yes, you yourselves planned evil against me. God planned it for good, in order to bring about what is this day, to preserve the lives of many people." Joseph, because of the abiding relationship with Adonai, realized the bigger picture of his life and circumstances. Remember now, Joseph was a dreamer, one whose dreams revealed God's will to him. Unlike his brothers, whose relationship with the God of their fathers did not mature or grow until the latter years of their lives, and even then it lacked the same intimacy as Joseph's or Jacob's. This is why Jacob in the parashah prophesies over his sons the troubles and circumstances that would befall them in the future, as well as the reason why these things would arise. Their former actions brought forth the future results. In other words, you reap what you sow. He did it to prepare them for the distant future. We must not forget that Jacob was a dreamer too, like Joseph, who had received many night visions and encounters with Adonai in his life. Jacob reveals these events and the character traits behind the prophecy so that they wouldn't lose hope in the promises of God. Remember, Joseph realized this principle as stated in Genesis 50, 19 through 20, to comfort his brothers in their impending fear of him and acting retribution upon them for their earlier sins against him after the death of their father Jacob. But Joseph only extended grace and mercy and love to them. Examples of how the sons of Jacob's lives were driven by their early actions are carried within the parashah and in the blessings that Jacob bestows upon his sons. We can see it through the lives especially of Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. The natural order of inheritance in the ancient Near Eastern world was the firstborn. The firstborn inherited a double portion of all things. But that changed because of Reuben's actions. Reuben was the right firstborn. But because of his actions, he lost the right of the firstborn because of his indiscretion in sleeping with his father's wife Bilhah. Jacob in turn bestows this upon Joseph by giving him a double portion of the inheritance, as recorded in Genesis 48, 21 through 22. Then Israel said to Joseph, "Look, I am about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you back to the land of your fathers. And now I myself give you one portion more than your brothers, that which I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and my bow." And this is speaking of the place called Shechem. Another way that Jacob had exalted Joseph as firstborn was by his taking Joseph's two sons, which were born to him in Egypt, to the Egyptian wife Asnath, Ephraim and Manasseh, and adopting them as his own sons, and thus creating the 12 tribes of Israel. He has taken them as his own. Why? Because Joseph kept faith in that which was God-honoring, and even though he was ruefully done by his own brothers, he chose to forgive and love them, while his brothers, who lived according to their fleshly desires and emotions, only felt true remorse for their actions against Joseph, after they encountered Joseph as the viceroy of Egypt. Simeon and Levi lost their rights to become the firstborn inheritors after Reuben because of their indiscretion and deception towards the Amorites' king's son, who desired to marry their sister, Tamar. But after an agreement was made between Jacob and the king, in order for his son to marry Tamar, Simeon and Levi went and killed all the men of the town while they were recovering from their circumcisions, bringing shame and dishonor on Jacob's word to the peoples around them. But still, in the end of all these things, Jacob's prophetic words ultimately proclaims hope and life to all of his children, as they all have a part in fulfilling God's plan, and therefore God will always remain over them, even though the disciplining and testing of them as God's will is not to destroy, but to build that true life in them. We find the same principle being explained by David to Solomon. It's a process of blessing and cursing. In 1 Kings 2, 1-4, David speaks, "Now when the time of David drew near to die, he charged his son Solomon, saying, I am going the way of all the earth, so be strong and be a man. Keep the charge of Adonai your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments and his ordinance and his decrees, according to what is written in the Torah of Moses, so that you may succeed in all that you do and wherever you turn, so that Adonai may fulfill his words which he spoke concerning me, saying that if your children watch their way to walk before me in truth and with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel." The future throne of David was dependent on the faithfulness of those who sat upon it. Yet it was because of Solomon's persistence into the beginning of his reign that brought the permanence of David's throne that will eventually result in the ultimate son of David, Yeshua the Messiah, who would be able to reign forever over the people of God. In 1 Kings 2:12, Solomon sat upon the throne of his father David, and his kingdom was established firmly. It would never be taken from David's descendants. David knew that without Solomon wholly giving the kingdom to God, he would never have the throne truly established in the eternal prophetic meaning that God intended for David's throne to be. Therefore, it is not strange that David challenges Solomon's obedience by charging him with the unpleasant task of settling old disputes and judgment that were due to those who had been done wrong within the kingdom under David's rule. But in like manner, when we come to the Chadasha portion, Peter also charges believers with the confidence and faith to endure that which will befall them because they have chosen to become the Lord's, as Peter introduces them as chosen by God for a specific purpose. 1 Peter 1:1-2. Peter, an emissary of Messiah Yeshua, to the sojourners of the diaspora in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, and set apart by the Ruach for obedience, and for sprinkling with the blood of Yeshua Messiah, may grace and shalom be multiplied to you. Peter is preaching a message of hope and trust in the fulfillment of God's promises in the salvation of Messiah Yeshua to those who were becoming despaired in the persecution they were being brought to in their faith walk in the Messiah. 1 Peter 1:3-6 continues, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Yeshua the Messiah. In his great mercy, he caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Messiah Yeshua from the dead. An incorruptible, undefiled, and unfading inheritance has been reserved in heaven for you. And by trusting, you are being protected by God's power for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. You rejoice in this greatly, even though now, for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials." See, Peter knew that it is by trials that we are refined into the pure gold of his image. It is by trials that the dross of our lives are burned away to enlighten our souls, and with that all-consuming love that is Messiah in us. But that is the fullness of our salvation, the overcoming of this life's troubles by allowing the light of God to shine through us despite the circumstances. This is showing the true life that is within each and every one who has come unto the Messiah. Thus Peter exhorts the brethren to strength and endurance and hope through faith, and in the love that God has for us, and the love that we should have with Him. It continues in 1 Peter 1, 7 through 9. These trials are so that the true metal of your faith, which is far more valuable than gold, which perishes through refined by fire, may come to light in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Messiah Yeshua. Though you have not seen Him, you love Him. And even though you don't see Him now, you trust Him and are filled with a joy that is glorious beyond words, receiving the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. As this year begins for us, these are things that we should consider. We are not promised glorious things on this earth. We're not promised an ease of life. If we truly belong to God, if we truly follow what He has called us to do. Jacob went through many trials and testings before he became the wise old one who gave the blessing to all of his 12 sons that would set the stage for them to become the nation of Israel. Joseph endured many trials in order to become so exalted that he was the second greatest leader in the known world. But yet, even though he had such power, he had great humility. He had great grace and great mercy. He never forgot who was really in control. But it took him going through the refining process of fire for him to become the viceroy of Egypt. It took David to go through the trials of the battles of Israel, being taunted by Saul, to realize that he was being refined to become that true shepherd king that God desired for His people. As God said, David is a man after my own heart. And Solomon goes through trials. He has to finish up what his father starts. It becomes his responsibility. He has to execute the judgment that his father could not. And Solomon was a man of peace. That's what his name means. His name is a derivative of peace. So that means Solomon wasn't a great warrior like his father David. Solomon did not pleasure in war. And yet Solomon had to execute great justice. And he did it because he knew that he would have to in order to be honored as God's king over Israel. And Peter, of all the disciples, should know suffering. How many times have we read where Peter was captured, thrown in prison, flogged, threatened with death, and eventually he was crucified. He was crucified upside down because he didn't feel worthy to be crucified like his master. And Peter says that you should rejoice in this greatly, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials. It is understanding that God brings us through rough times in order to build in us the qualities and the characters that will show forth His mercy, His grace, and His love, who He really is. It builds our faith to know that we can trust in Him to keep us and protect us. Because He will only allow us to go to such a point and no further. We know that because of the story of Job. God let Satan do everything to Job except take his life. He couldn't do that. God gave him a limit. And so when we go through circumstances this year, and when we go through trials and things that seem unfair, we need to remember that it is nothing more than the refining of our souls. And it's okay to cry out to God. It's okay to ask the Lord why. It's okay to seek His favor. He wants that because that's how you draw close to Him. If everything in our lives went so smooth and nothing ever caused us to realize that we do not have that kind of control over our lives, why would we ever look up to Him? Why would we ever call unto Him? Why would we ever ask Him for anything? We'd already have it. We wouldn't need it. We wouldn't desire it. When we look at some of the folks around the world that have everything and not have that relationship to God, they're never happy people. They're never satisfied in their lives. Some of the most esteemed, well-known people are some of the loneliest, depressed, and brokest as far as their soul goes. Why? Because the one thing that would give them the fullness of their life, the high of their life, is that salvation that they would receive from the Lord when they come to Him, when they turn their lives over to Him, when they repent and they confess and they take the sacrifice of the Messiah and they apply it to their lives and they turn around from the ways that they have been going and they walk therefore steadfast with God in the way He would lead them to do, then life becomes full. Life becomes a challenge. It may become hard. It may become sometimes even miserable. But it never comes to the point where you will abandon Him. Because if you remind yourself every time how much He endured for you, you can never do it. I don't think anyone in this room could endure what He endured when He was on the cross. Because He wasn't just put up there like the average criminal. He was made an example of, which meant His suffering was twice as much as the average one. He was flogged, whipped, beaten, had his beard pulled out, made to carry his own cross till he fell from exhaustion. And then to have spikes driven through his wrist, through his feet. And then hoisted up to hang. And the scripture says, a man hanged is cursed. So that he could take our curse. And a circumstance around that could ever say that we suffered more than our Lord and being refined for Him. I lost the page. But we should remember these words. The trials that we go through are so that the true metal of our faith, which is far more valuable than gold, may come to the light in the praise and the glory and the honor at the revelation of Messiah Yeshua. That though we've not seen Him, we love Him. And even though we may not see Him now, that we can trust Him and are filled with a joy that is glorious beyond words. For we will receive the outcome of our faith, which is the salvation of our souls. Life. That's the salvation. Real life. the life we have here ends. We can either live it into an eternity of non-existence and suffering, or we can rejoice in the fact that no matter what we go through now in this world, we have in life a height that will give us great pleasure and joy when we're with Him in eternity. You can't compare it. And so when we are going through our trials, let us rejoice, take heart in all that happens to us. It's not for our demise, but it's for our refinement and His exaltation and His glory. And therefore we are truly His. And people will see it. And they will ask Him. And then you can give the answer of the hope that resides within you. That is your moment to say, it's because the Lord has saved me and loved me. And therefore, I love Him. And I seek you to find your salvation. Good Shabbat.